I want to welcome you to the On the Road for Fair Wages for All Drivers. My name is Mark Zuckerman, president of the Century Foundation, and it's a pleasure to have you here tonight. I'm very pleased to introduce Meera Joshi, Commissioner of New York Taxi and Limousine Commission. The commission oversees the largest private for-hire ground transportation industry in the United States. Under her leadership, the agency has fostered tremendous diversity, growth, and innovation in the taxi car service ride-hailing industries while maintaining the highest standards for public safety and consumer protection. The Commissioner has initiated programs that have made the Commission a national leader in both accessibility for individuals with disability and traffic safety. TLC serves as one of the lead agencies in the New York citywide Vision Zero program. And speaking of Vision Zero, we also have Commissioner Polly Trottenberg here today. This is 2 for 1 night, so I'm sure Polly would be happy to take a few questions, or at least she may want to ask a few questions herself. So back to Meera. Before serving as commissioner, she was Deputy Commissioner for Legal Affairs and General Counsel. Prior to that, she served as the first Deputy Executive Director of New York City's Civilian Complaint Review Board, so she's used to complaints. And she was also served as Inspector General for New York Department of Investigations, which is a very good skill to have when you're running an agency. So, Meera, I just want to say that we're thrilled to have you here, and I just want to make one comment about our subject today. We know what the game is, that businesses want to engage these, what they call contractors, and expect them to work as hard as employees work. But at the same time, they don't want to pay the wages, benefits, and give them the working conditions that a hard-working employee would have. And what I see that the commissioner has done is called BS on that arrangement, and has suggested something that I think other jurisdictions all over the country are going to be looking at, is how to use her regulatory authority to make sure that the people who are driving for the public are paid the kind of wages that they can at least support a family on, that are fair for the kind of work that they're doing. So, Meera, welcome, and look forward to you and Andy, our senior fellow for workplace and work issues. We'll have a beginning discussion, then we'll bring the whole panel up and get this conversation going and engage some of the audience as well. So thank you so much for coming tonight.
Thank you. I want to thank Mark and the Century Foundation for having us, and also thank Polly for being such an amazing partner in all of the work that we do together with transportation and Vision Zero. I'm fortunate to have a colleague that I can work so well together with, and it's not always the case, but it is a real boon for the city when we can foster and continue to have a collegial relationship between agencies. So I just really want to personally thank Polly for everything she does to make us work together well. And again, not everybody likes to host TLC events. There are times that we end up getting kicked out of them. So I'm glad that you're unfearful on this one and you brought us in. So some people might ask, why is a taxi and limousine commissioner, a transportation regulator, presenting at the Century Foundation? And I think it comes down to 2 reasons: GPS and smartphones. The combination of GPS and smartphones have transformed work, and life of professional for-hire drivers in New York City is the starkest example. In the beginning, not all that long ago, the proposition of driving for an app company was intriguing and maybe even enticing. Don't deal with a garage, having to tip a grouchy dispatcher, or getting a beat-up car to drive. Don't worry about carrying cash. You don't have to pick up off the streets. You drive a luxury car. You probably get ticketed less by NYPD, since yellow cabs are ticket magnets, and everything's on the app. Your pay, your next job, your messages about how to make more money seems pretty seamless. What could possibly go wrong? So many of the first drivers were seasoned taxi drivers who saw this as a way to make more money with less hassles. Except over time, things did go wrong, and there did prove to be hassles. Maybe not so overt and as demanding as tips or charging excessive fees for the late return of a cab, but potentially much more permeating. One change to an algorithm and multitudes of drivers can see their pay adjusted downwards. Drivers can be encouraged to do just one more trip, extending their workday, and not always in a way that makes financial sense for them. And they may be steered towards certain sections of the city where passenger profits that go to the company are higher, even if the driver pay is not. And through aggressive incentives advertising to thousands of new drivers join the pool, increasing the competition and diluting take-home pay. So 4 years after the honeymoon period that those initial app drivers experienced, we are here today with over 80,000 drivers working for Uber, Lyft, and the rest, and 85% of them making less than the equivalent of a minimum wage. Hours are long and competition is continuous. And that's what brings me here today. A year ago, we decided to tackle this untenable situation. We directed the companies to open their books and show us exactly what they're paying drivers. And it turns out, contrary to the ads on the back of buses, they're not making a lot. Together with economists James Parrott of the New School, who's with us today, and Michael Reich from Berkeley, the following policy was developed. It has 3 components. Set a minimum pay per minute, and that's calculated to replicate what you need to get the equivalent of minimum pay standards. Set a minimum pay per mile. That covers the expenses, and there are many. Drivers bear them all. And the third but most important factor is tying what the companies are required to pay to their ability to keep drivers busy. If you can't keep your driver busy, you pay a price. And this is essential because with endless recruiting, the income protections are diluted, so there needs to be a mechanism to slow down the onboarding of new drivers and send more work to full-time drivers. In the last few years, the driver pool has increased by over 60,000. Today, there's over 180,000 licensed drivers. That's equivalent to a small city. So I want to stress this is the beginning. This is the beginning of a time when, as a city, we're taking a stand. Car service is not affordable if the driver cannot afford to live off of the pay that he or she gets for that service. We'll hear different comments on our policy and approach, and the good news is we're in the comment period of our rulemaking, so we welcome the input and have a history of incorporating to the extent that it makes sense, and we can. And they're built-in mandatory reviews, times when the commission must review the numbers and the approach and make changes if it's not working. There's also the larger question, what's the interplay of raising the pay of app drivers with taxi drivers who are struggling as more and more passengers frequently choose discounted car service through their phone? And I look forward to hearing the perspectives from both James Parrott and Bhairavi Desai on this subject. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Commissioner. Thanks to Mark for hosting this event. I'm Andy Stettner. I'm a senior fellow here at the Century Foundation, and we're going to have a little conversation and bring up the rest of our expert panelists. I just want to echo Mark. You know, we've been working on this question of the gig economy and the future of work. And it is truly groundbreaking what you've done to take this authority you have as consumer regulator and to set a sort of minimum wage. So I would just like you to elaborate a little bit more on why the TLC took up this issue and what have been some of the most challenging parts of working on this policy.
The TLC actually has a history of, we're mandated to look at driver income. It's part of our charter mandate. And so in the 90s, we did just that with taxi drivers. Taxi drivers before the 90s paid whatever price the garage set to lease a taxi. More and more drivers were coming on the road. People felt they were less experienced. They were working for less money, and it was leading to dangerous road conditions. So that's in the 90s when the commission first started regulating around driver pay and set lease caps, the maximum amount that you could lease a taxi vehicle out to a driver, And because we also set the metered fare, the difference is what the driver takes home. And so since the 90s, we've been doing that for the over 50,000 taxi drivers that have driven all those decades. And so we've learned a lot in that process about the differences between garage expenses and driver income and how that changes over time and how to compare that to other service industries. So really for us, it was a natural growth out of our existing responsibilities, but the magnitude is much larger. There's a lot more drivers and we don't set the metered fare. So there's a lot more unknowns. And we're dealing in a world where the way people pay drivers is extremely sophisticated now. And we're very conscious that whatever rules we make have to withstand sophisticated loopholes that can be easily come up with to get to sabotage the bottom line. So that's why it has to be sort of a continuous check-in because we don't have that same auditing ability as we do with the metered rate to know exactly what the passenger pays and what the driver makes.
So, yeah, I mean, talk a little, you just kind of pointed that out, this idea of, these companies being very sophisticated. I think for me, and I spent some time, in software development, before coming here to Century, and big in that was this idea of disruption. And clearly these platform companies came in as real disruptors in a way that was almost mocking of the regulatory process. And were successful at it for quite a long time. Where do we think you are now in terms of balancing? You have a service that's very popular among consumers with your agency's charge of serving the public good.
So I think that what makes New York unique is, first of all, we have never had those businesses operate in New York outside of regulation. So there's not a good old days to go back to. It's a different set of regulations than taxis, which has been extremely difficult for the taxi industry, but they never came in without any regulator that they had to answer to. And the other thing about New York City is it is a tremendously large market. So it's very hard for a business to walk away from New York City. So Uber or Lyft walked away from Austin and said, we don't want our drivers fingerprinted, take a hike. But that's not walking away from New York City. When you're walking away from New York City, you're walking away from 500,000 rides a day. And that's a tremendous effect on your bottom line. So that kind of calculation means that they have to make the balance here of being subject to the regulation. That being said, when we required them to put accessible vehicles on the road, they did sue us right after the rule passed. So they're certainly going to challenge every regulation that they feel like is not effective to the bottom line. But we're also not unfamiliar with being sued after we pass new rules. So that's okay too.
I'm going to bring in our panelists to continue the discussion, but first I just want to get a sense. I know I at least met 2 or 3 drivers who have come tonight, who want to raise their hand that are working in this industry, that are here tonight. So I really appreciate you coming. For sure, we're going to, after kind of get some initial thoughts from our panelists, we're going to bring in the audience and are eager to learn, your experience and get your reaction. But let me bring up our expert panelists, and we'll continue the discussion, here. So why don't you guys come up, and I'll introduce you once you kind of get up here. I'm truly excited to have this great panel here tonight to join the commissioner. So Bhairavi Desai, I first met in the Brecht Forum at her, I don't know if that was the very first office, but I think that was early days, in a very tiny office that was packed with largely immigrant drivers, forging this really one of the first pioneering, what we call worker center organizations that is developed into a powerful organization on behalf of drivers. And it's been in the forefront of this conversation about policy. Terri Gerstein is another longtime friend who applied really groundbreaking work first at the State Attorney General and then the Labor Department, and now is a fellow at the Harvard Law School Labor and Work-Life Program. And lastly, James Parrott, who had, from his vantage point now at the New School, was the author of the study that helped to craft this policy. So, Bhairavi, I'm going to start with you. there's now this proposed TLC policy on wages, and a cap at the city council has passed on for-hire vehicles. From your perspective, what's been accomplished so far, and what needs to come next in terms of making driving for all drivers in New York City, the panel of tonight's event, a living wage occupation?
Well, so first of all, thank you for this invitation. It's great to be here. I just want to give a little bit of our context, right, to this fight, because I think we could talk about numbers and all, but I think the number that's become the most important for us is the number 7, because there have been 7 drivers who've committed suicide over the past 10 months. And this is not only New York City, I mean across the globe, Australia, Taiwan, and India, and not just taxi drivers, but Uber drivers themselves. And it's a real vicious race to the bottom. We've seen technological changes in our economy, right, throughout history. But what we're seeing today is such a fast, expedited change overnight, where these companies have really used their wealth to leverage political favor in order to deregulate, not only to exempt themselves out of existing taxi rules and regulations, but of course to exempt themselves also out of labor law. They've done that in more than half the states across this country, and in 40 states across the country, they've exempt themselves out of local taxi regulations. So. And even in New York City, while we are the one city that has had more regulation than everybody else, we shouldn't kid ourselves that has meant very much, right? Because the regulation has meant that the corporations were able to enter the market here in the corporate licensing structure, the black car sector, which has the lowest threshold, right, compared to the yellow and even the liveries. I actually learned a lot of this from Commissioner Joshi's testimony at the City Council a couple years ago, where there's 5 different steps that livery bases have to go through in order to get a base license. You contrast that with the black car base license, where we could all get together and open up a shop, and so the corporate license is very deregulated. The driver's license, because of, I think the work of the Taxi and Limousine Commission going back a couple years now, all the drivers were under one universal license. And that is what sets this city apart from everywhere else in the country. So all the drivers started out similarly, but the economics, as long as the number of vehicles, the rate of fare, the cap on the expenses which the drivers pay, as long as these 3 factors remain unregulated, it's no driver could ever earn a living in this industry anywhere in this country. And the regulations that Meera was describing earlier, we were there. Those started in '97. We started organizing in '96. I mean, we were there at every single rule change the TLC's ever had. Many of those came from our campaigns. The lease cap and the fare raise. It took us. Our first fare raise was in 2004. It took us from 2004 to 2012 to get the rate of fare and the rate of lease cap where taxi drivers themselves could finally earn a decent living. And along the way, we fought against more vehicle licenses being issued, right? Now, in that scenario, imagine it took us all of those years, and then these companies come in without any of those regulations. Of course, everything is gonna, it's disruption is the absolute right word for it. But more than disruption, it's been really destructive. And I remember at the last April TLC public hearing, we testified about drivers having record high numbers of bankruptcies, foreclosures, people talking about homelessness. We've had members calling up about, feeling hungry. Coming to the office because it was the only place where they would get to nap for a couple hours because they were practically living on the streets. And this in an industry, right, that's extremely wealthy. I mean, the Wall Street financed app companies are collectively valuated at over $100 billion. And yet, now fast forward to today, 85% of app drivers through James's study were found to be earning under minimum wage, right? 80% of medallions are underwater. 80% of green cabs never even hit the street. And those green cabs were supposed to be a exclusively driver-owned market. So there's been so much economic despair, right? That's led to the day-to-day collapse that and this is for a workforce that's over 90% immigrant. It's not like people were partying it up to begin with, right? They were already living on the edges of poverty. They were finally, after a decade-long fight, were just about to have things get better, and then everything got turned upside down. The cap was absolutely necessary. I give a lot of credit. I know that the TLC under Meera's leadership had done great work in 2015, to fight for it at the time. Companies spent $10 million overnight. We all know what happened. It took us 3 years to get, to slowly win that fight. And I think, it really is just the beginning though, because we're getting a cap after there's so much destruction that's already happened, right? The current wage proposal that's on the floor, our approach is absolutely that the rate of fare that the companies charge the passengers, that minimum rate, has to be regulated. Otherwise, how could a driver of any other sector possibly feel confident that they themselves, who are dependent on a meter, could ever get a raise? And so that remains our approach. Our proposal on the table right now is that as TLC is looking at regulating the minimum app driver payments, that those rates really need to go up much higher than what's been proposed. And the drivers should be able to earn at minimum 80% of that. Our concern with the current proposal is it codifies something called upfront pricing, which maybe we'll get into details of it later on. But it's basically the Uber business model by which the company's been able to keep the highest percentage of the fare for themselves rather than it trickle down to the driver's earnings. It's also been during that slide that drivers have gotten deeper into poverty. And so we don't want to see that practice be codified. And we want driver earnings to not be static. We don't want a floor to become a ceiling, especially in an industry that does produce quite a bit of wealth. The workers who produce it through their labor should be able to access it and earn more. There's no concept of seniority in this industry. So at least your day-to-day earnings should not remain static or even at a minimum wage. There needs to be a prevailing minimum wage in an industry where the workers are paying all the expenses. They remain 30 times more likely to be killed on this job than any other workforce. And the apps have not changed that. We still see so many incidents of assaults on drivers in this sector as well. And there's a lot of wealth. There's tremendous wealth. It should go back to the workers who produce it. So that's really our approach. And just lastly, what I want to say is, in the 6 months that we campaigned that led to the cap and the other legislative victories, which we're really proud of, we did it with a principled unity campaign. Our position has always been, we're gonna sink together or we're gonna rise together. And we organized app, yellow, green, livery, corporate black car drivers together. It's not gonna be a zero-sum game where one sector is allowed to monopolize and destroy everybody else. That, it's too early for that. The workers in that remaining sector will absolutely get demolished if that happens today. Never, not to mention the fact that you still have 13,000 medallions out there that people invested into, and they've watched their retirements, their savings, everything just wash away. So there needs to be still much more financially, concretely, that the city does to particularly come to the aid of that of that sector and of the drivers who are seeing their retirement wash away. Especially, it's an aging community, an aging workforce, and we cannot look at this industry in a vacuum. It cannot be about one sector alone. It's got to be about all the 5 sectors that coexist on the streets of New York City. We're going to rise together or we're going to fall together. You know, none of us can make it alone. We're only going to make it if there's a policy framework that allows all of us to coexist.
No, I think especially at this point, people have bought these medallions, and it's been a regulatory policy change that have made that lost value. How do they get compensated? And I really appreciate what you're saying about bringing everyone together, and it's been tremendous to watch from the outside the campaign you've waged so effectively. But I'm going to bring James in to talk about what you said about this business model, and what about this business model of these companies, this distinct model. The commissioner mentioned some of the complexities that led to the need for this kind of pay standard. And I'm just really curious how you kind of used we're a think tank here, this real research-based approach to come up with this proposal.
Okay. First of all, thanks very much for inviting me, Mark and Andy, and this great panel. It's a wonderful opportunity. So this is a sector that's not monopolized by one company. Uber has a big market share. They have about 2/3 of the market. But Lyft has about 21%. So together they have 87%. So that's a lot of control. But there is real competition. And they compete over, you're trying to minimize a passenger's wait time. You know, people take out their app when they need a car, and they expect to be able to get one in short order. So being able to provide a lot of cars out on the street is very key to their business model. This is a really unusual industry from the point of view of an economist studying this, because this is the only industry I can think of where the capital is really provided by the workers. The companies provide very little capital, and yet the workers don't have a choice over when they use their capital. I mean, certainly they can decide when they're going to, drive out on the street and make themselves available for a trip, but they don't have any control over when a request for a trip comes into them. The company has that control. So you think about it, the companies are competing by trying to minimize the wait times. It's in their interest to have as many cars out there as possible. And of course, they don't have to put up the capital for that, so why not have as many cars as possible out there? So this creates, a real conflict and tension between the drivers and the companies. It cries out for regulation because the market, in this case, is not regulating itself. In fact, it's producing incredible inefficiencies in the use of capital resources. The drivers are putting up the capital, but they can't choose to use that. The companies have an incentive to have as many cars out there as possible. And that leads the drivers to be very inefficiently utilizing their own capital. So this is, again, this is an industry that cries out for regulation in order to force the companies to be more efficient. I mean, we all learn in Econ 101 that the market will force the companies to be more efficient. Otherwise, they'll run the risk of going out of business. But it doesn't happen in this sector, so it has to be regulated. And so in analyzing this, and we were very fortunate to be able to work closely with the Taxi and Limousine Commission and their incredible staff. And they have the authority under the city charter to require the companies to provide certain data about their operations. So we could look at driver earnings. We could look at what the aggregate passenger fares were. We could get an idea of what the company's commissions were on average, not on a per trip basis. We took all that into consideration, and we found out that trying to estimate what drivers' expenses were, that even with a very sort of conservative approach to valuing those expenses, 85% of the drivers were making less than the independent contractor equivalent of the minimum wage after covering their expenses. The median driver that is half the drivers making less than that amount, were making $14.05 an hour. And yet, keep in mind, these are drivers who should be paid not only for their time, but also for their capital investment. They're barely covering their capital expenses. They're not even making a profit on their capital expenses, right? They're barely covering those. So in the pay standard that the TLC developed and we helped them refine, it's a little bit complicated, but it provides a built-in incentive for companies to increase the utilization of drivers, that is, to be more efficient in how they manage the time of the driver. And that's really necessary because they're not doing that on their own. So if this pay standard were in place, or when it's in place, the expectation is that drivers will be doing more trips per hour that they have the app on, and that they're working, that they'll be able to cover their expenses and make at least $17.22 an hour. The reason that $17.22 an hour is that these are independent contractors. They have to pay their own employer payroll tax, right? The companies are not paying the employer payroll tax. So that's 7.65%. And given that there are many drivers who are working very long hours, there was also a provision to provide a modest 90 cents an hour for paid time off. So when you start with the 1722, apply the payroll tax, that's $1.32, subtract 90 cents from that, and you end up with $15 an hour. So this should produce the result where the companies are better utilizing the driver's time. That should, in the end, help with congestion. It may have a small benefit for medallion drivers, but other policies are really needed to do that. Along with the cap that was passed by the City Council, there's a mandate for a study, a year-long study that the DOT and the TLC are undertaking. That study should produce recommendations on how to better manage the growth in the apps going forward, so that we can avoid, replay of the situation we have now with, a tremendous surplus of cars out there, given the state of the market.
Well, Terry, that makes me think of this. So James did a great job describing the gymnastics that went into this proposal. But wouldn't you just say that these drivers should be treated as the employees of this company? And I understand the drivers are putting them forth to the capital, but can't we argue that it is in fact the apps that are controlling, what's happening? Shouldn't they have the right to minimum wage to join a union? And there's been a lot of debate about the gig economy, and so what do you think? How does what's happened here fit into this debate about these workers, and should they be just treated as employees and get all the rights that that most of us take for granted?
So first of all, thank you for inviting me today, and you're never going to get an answer no to that question from me. But I'll start out by kind of backing up a little and putting this in the framework. I'm not a driving expert or an expert on this industry, but I've spent a lot of time enforcing labor laws in low-wage industry, so I want to sort of put it into that broader labor context. And there's been a trend over the past several decades of what one expert has called the fishering of the workplace, which is that companies increasingly focus on their core competencies and they try and shed the obligation to have employees. And some do it by franchising and using a franchising model like fast food restaurants, and there have been efforts to hold the chain responsible for violations by franchisees. Some do it by subcontracting. This is very common, for example, in the construction industry where there's subs of subs of subs, and that's a way for the higher level entity to avoid their legal obligations. And then another way is through using independent contractors instead of employees. And I think it's important for people to understand, we all kind of have a vague sense of like what that means, but really to understand what's in play, because when someone is designated an independent contractor, because all of our labor and employment laws protect employees and they don't protect independent contractors. So what does that mean? That means, for example, minimum wage laws, which generally mean that if a worker has to pay money, in New York State, for example, if a worker has to pay money, in order to, for something like travel expenses or something, in order to do their job, that's treated as an unlawful deduction from wages if it's not reimbursed. Overtime, if you work over 40 hours a week, you get overtime. Unemployment insurance, workers' comp insurance. Drivers do have some workers' comp, but it is a very minimal, modest policy compared to what most workers get. New kinds of rights like paid sick leave and paid family leave, our employees get them. So when you look at, and then there are federal rights as well, like the right to organize a union under the National Labor Relations Act, the right to a safe workplace that doesn't endanger your health under the Occupational Safety and Health Act, and anti-discrimination laws as well. And so everything, and the tax laws as well, that require for an employee, the employer pays a portion of what's called the FICA, but if you're an independent contractor, the person has to pay more money. So there are like all of these different laws that protect employees. And so when you, like, every tiny little employer that you see or business that you see in New York City has to comply with all of these laws. There's a little, on my way in, I saw a little store called Flavors that had, prepared salads and food. Like, they have to comply with all of these laws. When someone has an independent contractor, it is an incredible cost savings, and that creates an incentive for employers and for businesses to try and shoehorn workers into this model, which is obviously incredibly disadvantageous to workers who don't access these rights. In the instance of, in the case of drivers, this is an issue that's being litigated. It's been in several states, as I think one of the previous speakers mentioned. In several states, there have been laws directly on point that are favorable to the companies, basically, allowing them to treat workers as independent contractors. But in other places, there have been court decisions finding them as employees, and those decisions are working their way up. In New York State, there were some some Uber drivers who applied for unemployment insurance and were found to be employees, and that is now going up to the appellate division, the appellate courts. And the administrative law judges looked really, really carefully because, obviously they knew this was I assume they looked carefully at every single case. But in this case, obviously I'm sure they were aware of the sensitivity of the issue. And, they really, really looked at the factors related to employment versus independent contractor status. What the law is on this is in New York at least, each and every law has a slightly different definition of what's an employee and what's an independent contractor. The way I always describe it is like if I said them all to my mom, who's a retired second grade teacher, she would say they all sound exactly the same. So they're like very similar, but with slight tweaks. In some states, they have a better law, a better standard, the ABC test, which has 3 factors, and one of them is if the workers are doing what's the core business of this company, then they're employees. So under the ABC test, I think it would be very hard indeed to make the argument that drivers in these instances are not employees. But in New York, the unemployment insurance administrative law judge went through many, many factors and found that that the drivers were employees. And some of the factors that were examined were, for example, the level of, the courts always look in these situations at the level of control that's exerted. And so the ability of the app to deactivate and to kick people off of the app, it's the equivalent of being fired if they didn't meet certain standards. Also, if you're a real independent contractor, you have the ability to set the rate for what you're charging. Some other third party doesn't set the rate for you if you're really running your own business. And then there's this whole fallacy about the flexible hours that, like, if you become an employee, then you can't have flexible hours, which is just, it's just a made up thing. Because there are plenty of employees who can have flexible work hours. There's no prohibition or nothing that says that an employee can't have flexible work hours. So this is an issue that's going to continue to be litigated to some extent, except that litigation is really curtailed by the fact that there are forced arbitration agreements for a lot of drivers. And these arbitration agreements prevent people, I think now, like pretty much everyone, I mean, you would know better than I would.
It's like 1,500 who opted out in New York.
Right. So almost all of the drivers have forced arbitration, which means that they can't bring a class action because there's a class waiver. They can't go to court to challenge their status. So really, it depends upon government actors being able to do something and make determinations about their employee versus independent contractor status, and other kinds of laws being passed, and then the drivers that have opted out being able to exercise their rights. But in terms of, I think an interesting question is like, how does the TLC's proposal fit into this question of independent contractor versus employee? And what I think is so striking about or meaningful about the proposal is just that so often in legal situations, there's just this whole like bottleneck of independent contractor versus employee, and in the end, like while that litigation is going on, people are really struggling. And so this is sort of, the TLC doesn't have the jurisdiction, as far as I understand, to make the determination whether they're employees or independent contractors. That belongs with other agencies. But it's like, I think it's a sign of sort of visionary government when a person in government or an agency looks at like, okay, what are the powers that I have and how can I use them to improve people's conditions? And so the TLC can't make that determination of employee status, but this is at least something that can be done. So I think it's important to recognize how significant this is, because I think it's really, as far as I know, one of the first times, if not the first time that I can think of, that there's been a proposal for a wage standard for workers who are not currently treated as employees. But at the same time, when you think of what is being asked of Uber and Lyft compared to like the Flavors store downstairs, it's really very modest.
Well, thanks, Terry. So I want to go back to some of the details of the proposal and then talk a little about the politics. And just wanted you can comment, Commissioner. What I hear you say, Bhairavi, was that there should be some more transparency of the fare. That the fare that just like a yellow cab, the fare that the customer pays, that the driver should keep a certain percentage of that, and that's what's necessary to equalize things. James, is that something that you considered as an option? What's your thought about that? Kind of comment that Bhairavi had.
Well, so we had the disadvantage of not having, as I mentioned earlier, we didn't have the passenger fare per trip. So we couldn't analyze that. What we had was the aggregate passenger fare that each driver generated for a week. So we looked at that, as the revenue that the company took in and then paid the driver, and we looked at what their implicit commission rate was, and so on. The TLC, always striving to get a better handle on this, we'll be getting additional data where we will be able to look at that question. So we are going to look at that and think about how whether or not the pay standard needs to be modified.
And this is something that came up with drivers at our hearing that we had last week, where a lot of drivers, due to the upfront pricing policy that now exists.
Do you want to explain that for a minute for the
So
audience?
when Uber first and Lyft and the apps first operated, a driver made a percentage of what the passenger's fare is. So as the passenger's fare goes up, so does the driver's, because they're aligned. And then at a certain point, they switched to upfront pricing, where they said, driver, you're going to get paid, and there's a schedule that drivers get, this per minute, this per mile, and that's what your pay will be at the end of the trip. The passenger gets a upfront price of how much they're going to pay for the trip based on an algorithm that is not related to the drivers. And so there's those two basically unhooked. And so there's this sense, and this is what we'll find out now that we're going to start getting the more data, is that disparity becoming larger, or is there and what also happens is sometimes there's subsidizing going on, so the driver's making more than what the passenger's paying on some trips. In areas where the companies want to bring in more passengers, they're going to lower the price, bring in more passengers, subsidize the trip. But I think, to a point that I've heard Terry speak about often, is the concept that if productivity keeps going up and profits keep going up, should the pay of the person who's generating those profits stay stagnant, or should that also rise with the profits? And that's something that once we're able to get that level of transparency and understand what that looks like, NYTSWA has done some work on that with the groups of drivers that you work with that have voluntarily given information. But we are talking about companies that do 500,000 trips a day. So in order to really have a policy that understands the consequences in a multitude of situations, we need to look at those hundreds of thousands of trips over time and over different seasons. But it is, I think, going to be very revealing when we start analyzing that additional passenger information to see if are there instances where the driver's only making 50%, and how often is the driver making more and the passenger's fare being subsidized. And that has other ramifications, which I'll turn to Polly for, and like, do we want people in for-hire vehicles in areas where we already think there's enough congestion?
I just want to add something. I mean, so that we, in our rule, so the city charter allows you to petition the TLC for rulemaking. And so when we, both at last April's public hearing, because at that time Uber was experimenting with upfront pricing, and then in May 2017 is when it became, their business practice across the board on every fare. Members of ours was, the lawsuit that Terry alluded to in the federal court in New York State is it's actually our member's case. Biju Haider is one of the plaintiffs in the case. And the UI case was actually also 3 of our Uber members. We had to sue the governor to even get them to process the unemployment claims that our members had filed. And one of the 3 members, he was found to be eligible for unemployment because there were weeks, not only where he earned below minimum wage, there was one week in particular where he earned literally a penny after putting in 48 hours of work that week. So, and he left the company and he was found, but he was voluntarily found to have been unemployed because of the poverty wages. So we had petitioned the TLC, to look at the issue of upfront pricing, where based on our own analysis, what we found is that whereas Uber prior to May 2017 was taking 20 to 25% of the fare, under upfront pricing, just as they started to charge the passengers a higher rate of fare, they were taking on average closer to 30% of the fare from the driver. On some trips, it was as much as 50%, even as much as 60% of the fare they were keeping for themselves, right? And what's really interesting here that I want to highlight is not only did this happen as they were charging the passengers more, but also importantly, if you took each of those trips as we did for about 200 of them, and you calculated what would have been the cost of that same trip under the taxi meter, the Uber fare upfront pricing rate that the passenger paid was actually, it was 12% higher than what it would have been on the taxi meter, even though they continued to publicize their rates as being cheaper than a taxi. Well, the rates that they were publicizing were the cheaper rates by which they were paying the driver, right? And so the tagline of our Unity campaign has been, Uber starves the Uber driver so they can starve the taxi driver. That's why you cannot address only one. You have to find a way of raising the standards for everybody. We believe that TLC has a real opportunity right now to look at that delta, which we call income inequality. Average CEO makes 230 times more than their average employee. If you compare in the Uber world, Uber CEO makes 5,715 times more than an Uber driver who earns $35,000 a year. And one of the ways that this inequality has really widened is this practice of upfront pricing. And so our proposal has been to go back to how Uber used to split the fare, right? Where you kept 80% of whatever the passenger paid. Now, if they want to experiment with what they're going to charge the passenger, that shouldn't be on the driver's back. It should, so the TLC must still regulate the minimum rate of fare, or at the moment what they're authorized to do, which is regulate the minimum rates by which the companies would use to calculate the rate of that particular trip, right? Because like I was saying earlier, no cap on number of vehicles and no regulation on the rate of fare is what brought people into this poverty. So after we lost in 2015 is when the streets started to get flooded with the vehicles. By February 2016, they cut the rate of fare. That was the beginning of the economic crisis that you see among the drivers across the board. It impacted all the other sectors, and it simultaneously impoverished the Uber drivers. So the city has an opportunity right now, to regulate these rates. And in April or May, when the city will, by law, will be required to look at the yellow cab rate of fare and lease cabs, it could, at that time, study from January to March the impact of congestion pricing, and then be ready to see if we can have raise the taxi metered rate to be similar to what the rate would be for the Uber driver payments. So then all drivers across the board could get a raise, and as long as these rates are regulated, the companies could not undercut them, right? Where the other sectors would be left with the fear that they're going to lose out on fares. So that, and these are really, everyone's on the edge, right? Yes. Everyone's on the edge of poverty, and everyone's on the edge of anxiety because nobody knows what's going to happen. And there are people who are much deeper on edge, right? But I think there's a real opportunity for the city to take advantage of these studies, the fact that we have real labor economists really looking into this industry. And I don't think it's totally unprecedented that the TLC would do this, because there's been a 20-year driver movement that's fought for this to not be a consumer agency, but to also have labor functions to it. And that's why the rate of fare, the number of vehicles, and the expenses that the drivers pay in the yellow cab side, that's why they've all been regulated. It was a 20-year struggle on our part to bring it to that point. We now want to take advantage of that history and have it extended into this new sector.
Let me ask the commissioner what you thought of that, as I'm just fascinated by this, this change. What I really see is this kind of 180-degree shift from when the cap first happened, and I'd like to hear from her about the organizing, what you all thought of as the turning point in that. And one thing was interesting, that getting this data was part of the turning point, right? Now you have the information, but what did you see as a turning point in this effort? Because it really seems to have now changed, and it's really substantially.
Well, I think a lot of it is politics. And I don't know what the defining moment the politics of the defining moment in 2015 when the city and the council walked away versus the defining moment in 2018 when the city and the council said we're not walking away. But I don't want to minimize that those are the moments that make or break whether that law gets passed. What helps people get to those moments are a variety of things. Extreme lobbying, heavy campaigns, but I think also in this case, having more information about what was happening on the streets and what was happening to the drivers. In 2015, we were just starting to get trip data, and what we were able to say in 2015 was, look, the vast majority of these rides are actually happening in Manhattan now. We know that. So we don't, and before that, the sort of tagline was like, everybody's getting a ride, it's a good thing, don't worry about it. we were on the front line. We saw 2,000 new cars come on every month. We saw 2,000 to 3,000 new drivers come on every month. And we saw that the congregation of trips was actually happening in the place that already has tons of transportation. And so that seemed to sort of scream out like, this is a city problem. But that, you know, as we got more information, and that's when we just started collecting trip data, as we got more information about the number of trips that was increasing, the fact that the number of trips wasn't exactly could be linked to one car. The cars were being used extremely inefficiently. So whereas taxis would do sort of 22 trips a day, a lot of these cars were doing 9 trips a day. So it took a lot more cars to do the same amount of trips. And that they were spreading all over the city, which has been a boon for passengers. We do get a lot of feedback from passengers who love the fact they have service in neighborhoods they didn't have it before. But you could see, because the drivers coming in and the cars coming in just wasn't letting up, that there was never going to be enough pie to go around. So that additional information about the volume, the trips, that they were still dispersed among too many cars, still dispersed among too many drivers, and then finally the actual numbers on how little money drivers are making. And I think a lot of it comes down to the empathy of New Yorkers. So 7 suicides, and at that time there were 6, combined with the fact that drivers are not making any money, turn the council around. Because no matter how much people in their neighborhood might like a service, and no matter how much a company might say, we'll help you out with this community project or that community project, at the end, I think the council showed that their human side, their empathy for the fellow New Yorkers, and the numbers showed that there was widespread poverty among this large working group.
James, Terri, you've been around labor issues for a long time, and I think this has been a real sea change. So I'm curious of your thoughts about observing this.
Well, I think the situation with the drivers, the medallion drivers, the suicides, and the incredible organizing that the Taxi Workers Alliance did had a lot to do with sort of keeping the council's feet to the fire on this, and the mayor's feet to the fire on this. You know, you have to add in the fact that Uber's reputation is not the same as what it was in 2015. And, you know, people are also a little more, you know, jaded in their view of the role of venture capital. And this is really an industry that's been propelled by venture capital. I mean, it was the enormous sums of venture capital money that made possible this media blitz in 2015 that killed the possibility of a cap at that point. So, you know, a lot of things have changed here, but I think it's very clear that there's more sort of appreciation on the part of the riders that they like the convenience of the service, they like the affordability of it to some extent, you know, and the fact that the MTA service has deteriorated over the years for lots of reasons, but people could see that the real impact that it had on drivers, and there was a lot of empathy for that.
This kind of proposal, was that going to lead to a price increase? Do you think it will, the result?
Well, so we tried to analyze that very carefully, and it seems like the companies are doing very well. Some people have the impression that because Uber, you know, lost an historic level of money in 2017, that they're subsidizing all of the rides. That's not true. They're making a lot of money. The for-hire vehicle sector is incredibly profitable in New York City, and they have commission rates that are pretty high on average. Again, given that this is an industry where they are not putting up the transportation equipment capital, the drivers are. So there's a fair degree of latitude in their commissions. They would still be incredibly profitable given the investment, their skin that they have in this game. They would still make a lot on that if they kept fares down. So we analyzed that the companies could adapt to paying the drivers more. The increased wait time, you know, it's going to be on the order of 12 to 18 seconds. On a 5-minute trip, I challenge anybody to really, know unless you have a stopwatch out, to be able to detect that. But they would have to bring their profits down a little bit, and they would still be making, multiples of the profits for, so, say, a comparable sector like credit card companies that make a 3% or 2 to 3% commission on it. So they would still be making well more than that.
Right. So Terry wanted to jump into this then.
Right. I was just on your question about what's different now than 2015. I think we would all agree there's a lot that's different now than 2015 nationally. And I think that, there's been a lot of movement among worker organizations and there's the fast food workers movement and the Fight for 15, and then so many different worker organizations, which the Taxi Workers Alliance has been at the forefront nationally of this kind of work. And then there's the Me Too moment, and I think that it's just a time, I've been doing this work for a long time, and these used to be like, I describe it as they used to be kind of like stepchild issues, and now it's like really, really front and center, the issue of income inequality and the degraded working conditions that people have, and just the complete rupture of the social contract in terms of how people should be treated when they work. And so I think that, I can't guess anything about the New York City Council, like the City Council or the mayor, but I do think that like within society at large, there's been a real shifting in the public view of, companies in relation to the people who do the work. And I can't, I have to imagine that that also had something to do with it. It's a very different moment right now than it was, certainly 10 and 5 years ago, but also 3 years ago.
Let's give a chance for some of the audience to come in. I particularly love to have this and start with some comments from some of the drivers that are in the audience that might want to share their view on the policy or ask any questions. And so in commenting, because I know I have a lot of interest, I would say try to keep your comment to a minute, and if you do have a question for the panel, we'd love to hear it. And say your name, please, sir.
Oh, my name is Biju Haider. I've been in this profession since '89. Currently, I'm working with the Bhairavi Taxi Worker Alliance. Last just 1 year. First of all, Meera, I have agree with you that 2015 was the best moment for the capital, for the cab. If it would have happened that time, Seven Brothers still would survive. Mm-hmm. They probably would be in this, So we have to find out why did it happen? How did it happen? Why did not cab that time? With the effort of the Taxi Worker Alliance, we went to the cab. It's too late. And one more thing, Meera, about the regulation, the fare. You have the regulation, yellow and green. You usually could put this regulation to the app base.
Mm-hmm.
You do,
And we get the authority under the council laws that were just passed. After we study it, we then have the authority to regulate the fares in the app-based industries.
I mean, why it's dividing now? I mean, drivers are all drivers. At the end of the shift, everybody's there. No matter, I drive Uber. I drove yellow 20 years. Mm-hmm. I've been driving Uber since 2012, but I'm still driver. Mm-hmm. So I think the regulation should be same for the, for all sector of the drivers. And I will be appreciated if you respect on your regulation, put back to yellow-green regulation to the same the app-based driver, and I'm appreciate the James study. But you should study with whenever you do the study about the fare base, you should, allow some drivers in your side,
Absolutely.
Because
that's coming up.
This is very important. The new school is there. They do any study. They're not going to hire anybody from the TLC, right? So driver knows what's happening, So I think you should look after that. And still, I appreciate you trying your best. Keep it up.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Great. So,
Hello, my name is Barry Napak, and I've been in the taxi business since '72. I own medallions, I drove cabs, I had a black car, now I'm retired, and I'm an investor. But I don't understand this. Nobody makes any money now. Uber's losing money more and more each year.
Not on the service in New York City, they're not losing
well,
money.
well,
They're
well,
losing money on their other
How do you know that?
investments.
How do you know that?
Because we looked at the passenger revenue that came in, and we estimated what their expenses
Who
were.
gave you those
And then we
figures?
did some other
Well,
ways of checking that
Well,
researchers use.
I see. But, okay,
And,
so
and we're very confident that they're making hundreds of millions of
Okay,
dollars.
so they're making money only here,
Yeah.
but not everywhere else.
We don't know because we haven't looked at it.
Okay, and the figures you got were from Uber and from the drivers? Were they audited?
From the companies.
Were they statistically audited?
No.
Okay.
Say no.
Well,
Ju-
so,
ju-
so, so they gave us data that showed that they were making money when they're not making money?
I don't know.
I
I'm
don't
just
know.
asking if you audited. Okay. But, okay, so now and the TLC,
Make
years
sure
ago,
maybe just ask one more.
One more question?
Yeah,
Okay.
okay.
everybody else, only Uber's making money in New York, but everybody else is losing money, correct?
Well, we don't know about Lyft and the other companies. We don't know if they're losing money.
Okay, and you said that there's competition, but the two companies control 88% of the business in New York
Yeah.
City? Wouldn't you call that an oligopoly, a monopoly?
Oligopoly.
Oligopoly.
Well, so
okay.
so in an
Okay, I'll-
oligopoly,
okay.
there is competition
And also,
between
one
the
other
two
thing, you made a
organizations.
mistake, that the Uber drivers, they pay 14% of the Social Security. They pay the employee and the employer contribution.
No, well, it comes to 15.3.
Okay, but you said 7.
Well, I think.
Well, so
I'm
the-
saying his half,
everybody
one
has
half.
to pay the employee share. They're also paying the employer's share. Together, that's 15.3.
Okay, go ahead. I was gonna-
Quick comment. Uber lost $11 billion by their own admission. That's a fact.
4 billion, well,
$11
$11 billion over,
so
over
far,
a few
but-
years.
okay.
Right.
We've all agreed that driver income's gone down. We've all agreed that it's because there's too many vehicles on the road. So I think in order to determine a course of action for the future, we have to figure out where we are now and how we got there. And I'm just wondering about that rule that's in Section 59 that states that all black car vehicles must be cooperators or franchisees of a base. So there's 100,000 black cars out there. Is every one of them a member of a cooperative or a franchisee? Is that rule being enforced?
I think the relevant rule now is the one that was just passed by City Council that we're doing the implementing rules on, which affects the apps, and that's the high volume for hire services. That's every service that does more than 10,000.
So will that
gives
rule
us-
still be in existence, that they have to be cooperators or franchisees of bases in order to operate?
Yeah, unfortunately, not all of the older ones, will meet every letter of the law on the cooperation and franchise. It's not something that is
But what about
often
the Ubers?
applied.
Are they all
They
members
will
of
apply
cooperative?
with the high volume, which has a long, and I'll send you a copy of the law if you're not familiar
No,
with
I
it.
am familiar with it.
And so you can look at that. That's the let's look at the relevant
So you don't want to
factors
answer
now.
the question, are they cooperators now?
They
Because my point is, if
submitted
you've
paperwork.
overlooked this for the
But I
last
think
5
the
years,
point of
this
this
is how we
for,
wound up with 100,000
listen,
vehicles on the road.
We've done this for 4 years now. I think this is, let's let somebody else talk.
So okay. Well, I do. Let me hear from the gentleman. Go ahead.
My name is Sergio Cabrera. I'm a medallion owner and a taxi driver, 20 years. I agree with many of the comments that were made. Bhairavi Desai, a lot of work that she's done. The only thing I really disagree on is that it's pretty hard to have livery, yellow, green, and try to get everybody on the same page because we're all competitors. It's not going to happen. TLC is regulating yellow, green, black cars. They have a conflict of interest. It's not working out. 2015, there were 14,000 cars in the Uber application. Now there's 100,000. That's the dividing line there. There's 100,000 cars. We're looking like for needles in a haystack. This is a very simple solution. You want to get Uber driver pay up. You have too many cars on the road. There's too many Uber cars. You have to slash the Uber cars, not with this ridiculous cap that you just had. The cap was passed, this rule. There are more Uber cars on the road today than there were the day that the mayor signed the bill. And there's another 16, 20,000 cars going to come online. It's ridiculous. It's a ridiculous thing. Now, maybe it'll empower the city council to keep moving onward with some more regulations because they dropped the ball back in 2015. But the TOC commissioner, the commission will have the power and duty to set and enforce rates of fare to be charged and collected. The commission will prescribe, revise, and regulate reasonable rates of fare that may be charged and collected. When you say that you have no power to regulate what Uber charges, that's disingenuous.
I didn't say we don't
Yes, you
have the
did. You
power.
said it-
I
you
said
s-
there was another
Give her a chance to respond,
council
please.
bill that asks us to study it and then determine whether to set rates of fare.
Commissioner, this is now. What happened then? How come you didn't use that power that you had then? Why would you let Uber come in and lower the fares whenever they want? You've never allowed anybody, the TLC has never allowed anyone to do that before. Why
We
would
never
you?
stopped local car services from lowering fares.
Local car services had to send a schedule to you, and
We
it had
never
to be
saw
approved
black
to the
card
TLC by the
companies from
TLC.
offering discounts or group fares.
That's not the same thing as having a steady price that's below what the taxis are charging, okay? That's below what the taxis are charging, and then they raise it up 2 or 3 times to make up for that supposed benefit that they're giving the public. The TLC has failed the yellow medallion system. It has failed the city of New York. You have taken a viable 100-year institution from the levels of that any
I
city
think
would
for the
kill to
benefit
have
of
this.
everybody else
Let
here,
me
if you
finish.
could ask
Let
a
me finish.
question,
You
that would be
interrupted me the
helpful.
other day at the city council. That's why at
Sir,
the
sir,
TLC
can you-
meeting.
can you
That's
just-
why I
sir,
haven't
why-
been back. So let me just say what I have to say, okay? And then you could say whatever you want to say, okay? The TLC has failed us as medallion owners who have bought into a city franchise that had rules and regulations, that had protections set into it to make sure that our investment was a viable investment and it was, I'm not going to say guaranteed, but it was going to be maintained at a certain level, okay? The TLC, the yellow cab system has given the city $20 billion worth of tax money over the last 20 years, and your administration and the previous administration, which you were still part of, destroyed that industry.
Okay, sir,
and
so
you're responsible for
All right,
it.
sir, come
And
on,
you, after 7 deaths, should not be TLC commissioner.
Hi, my name is Liz. Just shifting gears a bit. I had a question about sort of weaving together a few things some of the speakers said. Terry mentioned that one of the rights independent contractors don't have is the right to organize and form unions and bargain collectively. Obviously, the Taxi Workers Alliance has been sort of ignoring that lack of a legal framework. But of course, there's an important case being litigated out on the West Coast over the question of whether, like fair wages and other certain new protections for independent contractors, we ought to be thinking about and legislating the right of independent contractors to organize and bargain collectively. And so I would just be curious about the speaker's views about that litigation in particular and the policy idea more broadly.
Also, I just want to thank Liz to come, who might be being your deputy commissioner for labor standards enforcement in the city of New York. So thank you very much for being here as well.
May I respond to that?
Yeah, go ahead.
So we have charges against Uber at the National Labor Relations Board. So just for those not familiar with it, you know, is when Terry was kind of going through the litany, right, of employee rights, unless you win classification as a whole, you end up piecemealing each of those rights for, you know, for workers that are being classified or misclassified as independent contractors. So the right to a democratic union and collective bargaining, you know, is protected under the National Labor Relations Act, which the board oversees. So we have filed charges, against Uber. I mean, obviously, you know, the White House controls that board, so it's not like anybody in labor is expecting any pro-worker decision to come out of that board anytime soon at the moment. But those charges are alive, and it's not only in New York, but there are other states. In California, it's also been filed. But the thing I want to go back to is, I think the second point that you had made, and that also connects back to what Terry was saying. You know, we take for granted in New York that, you know, while this may be an otherwise progressive city, you know, when it comes to workers' rights, there's still a lot that needs to be changed. And particularly when it comes to the courts, I mean, the Second Circuit has become increasingly conservative, right? And so while the ABC test, or what's like when you look at the economic realities, like who really profits and who controls the profits, is what a state like California, right, is really leading in making that be what the courts have to focus on. In many other courts, including our circuit, is looking more at who controls when you clock in. It doesn't matter that the economics which the company controls ultimately decides when you clock out, right? Because you're not clocking out until you make enough money, and how much you make is still controlled by them. But the courts are just looking at when you start your shift. And if you determine you're the one that has that control, then forget everything else, every other layer of control. That one issue predisposes you to be an independent contractor. We need a legislative fix, that we need a proper ABC test in the state of New York, number one. The second big circuit issue that's happened in New York as far as drivers are concerned, there's a federal exemption of overtime pay for taxi drivers, which was just recently affirmed here. And so even if, for example, Uber drivers were found under New York state law to be employees, they would still be exempt from overtime pay protection because of that, right? And then arbitration issue, which of course went all the way up to the Supreme Court, as Terry mentioned. And that also, given we have class restricting arbitration, is all the more reason why collective bargaining rights need to be preserved for working people, right? We need a legislative fix in this state. The other side has been, working together. The gig lords, as we call them, have been working together to really lobby to undo employee protections, and it's explicit exemptions that they win in the state. So the law will literally say that you can have all these layers of control, but if the company that employs you dispatches you through an app, then they are exempt from employer responsibility. It's that explicit. It starts with Uber and Lyft because they've had more political leverage, because they have more consumer appeal, but it goes to Handy and TaskRabbit and across the board. These companies collectively represent less than 1% of the national workforce, yet they're winning exemptions and overturning labor laws that generations of workers have died to protect. And it's just a matter of time before you have, traditional employers. Why would Dwayne Reed not go ahead and start scheduling you through an app? It's a matter of time, right? And that's why there's so much Wall Street investment into these companies. We forget that it's the real service that they're providing isn't that you can get a cheap ride. It's actually all the political capital they've invested to really undo labor law that's going to affect the rest of the economy. So we need those changes here.
That's why I think this issue has been much bigger than just these drivers. I think it's speaking to a bigger issue in the economy. We just have a little bit of time left. I want to at least get one more question in. From the gentleman over here.
I wanted to say one more thing.
Okay, good. Let me get him in.
Yeah.
Hi, my name is David Pollack, and I'm an industry consultant. I've been in the industry my whole life. I have a number of questions, points to make.
So we only have a little bit of time, so maybe just take one comment, one question.
With regard to, well, we'll get into something else, though, but with regard to everything people have said now, where we understand more cars, it's more congested than ever before. We have a cap, which I want to get into in a second, but I was the head of an association where members would come to me that were part of credit unions, who've been left out of this discussion, by the way, and they would show me, they were Uber drivers, and they would show me, they would converse with their passengers, and they were getting $45 for a fare that was X amount of dollars, but the passenger was being charged $120. And my question is, I guess, is it still going on? Is there any evidence, as the information comes in, that's still going on, because that makes all that changes all the statistics.
So I think.
And all,
Okay.
okay, that's part of the question, and then I'll ask my second part of the question also.
Let's
There's
just,
a cap
for the
that's
interest of
10.
time, let's just do the one-part question. So, Meera,
So I think that's information that we'll be able to, we'll be able to answer that question very accurately in the coming months, because what we had before didn't give the per trip passenger fare, and what we're getting now will be all of that information with every passenger fare and every driver payment. And we can do the kind of analysis that's necessary, because it may be that that's happening in some sections of the city and in other sections of the city it's not. I think that's important for people to know. And then overall, what does it average out to in terms of driver pay versus passenger pay?
So there's a lot more I think we all like to say, and we're going to continue this conversation over drinks and mingling, but I'm going to give Bhairavi the last word, because she's certainly the first person who ever told me anything about this problem, maybe 20-something years ago. So.
Well, I just wanted to say maybe, the organizer in me needs to address the elephant in the room. So, I got the thing is, we can all talk theory and numbers and all, and they're really important. We have to do it, right? But I think there's a real frustration for a lot of people who just seen their retirements wash away and seen everything they invested into wash away. And I actually think in the 22 years that we've been organizing, I actually find Meera to be one of the most engaging commissioners we've ever seen. And yeah. And I know, and genuinely cares for drivers, right? Genuinely cares for drivers. I also know, though, that there was a systematic failure here, right? For those of us in the industry, we can't ignore the fact that the former chairperson left the agency, went straight to work for Lyft. His policy director left the agency, went straight to work for Uber. And the fact that this is their biggest market, it is the market in the entire globe where the city would have had leverage. And you can't help but to feel yes, 3 to 5 years ago, there was an utter failure to regulate, that there wasn't a foresight to regulate. And given those conflicts of the people who were in charge at that time, you can't help but feel that it was a failure that was deliberate, and that the people who were on the front lines and who it cost everything to, 94% of them are immigrant. Majority of them are people of color. Many of them started out as drivers, worked 20, 30 years before they ever invested and bought a medallion. They didn't become millionaires overnight, right? They never became millionaires, period, And so it's true that I always say this, of the 7 drivers, and there were livery drivers, a black car driver, an Uber driver, and 3 yellow cab drivers, 1 lease driver, and 2 owner drivers. Nicanor Ochasor didn't have a very high mortgage left to pay. He was nearing retirement. What he saw was a future where he and his wife, after 30 years of working the medallion, splitting the shift, it's all they were ever going to see going into their 70s, 80s, possibly their 90s. And then you had Kenny Chow, who had a high mortgage, but every month he couldn't keep it up. His last mortgage payment actually bounced. And what he believed was that he purchased his job, and he just wanted to earn enough so he could keep up his payments. He wasn't even thinking of retirement because he knew that's collapsed. But he was looking just to survive every day. He had finally become on the higher earning end of the driver spectrum as an owner driver. And they were the first people to be hit. They were the people who went from being the highest earning to the lowest earning overnight with the highest in debt. And that, given the conflicts and given the city that we live in, given the role that yellow cabs have played historically, the amount of money that's been contributed by this industry, it's hard for that failure when it is so personal to not feel criminal, right? And I do think that's a really valid, I think that's a valid point that people are coming from. What I like to believe, what I like to hope is that after all these years of failure, for the people that are still holding on and that are still fighting, that we're gonna start to turn a better day. That there are people in power. You asked the question earlier, what made this possible? We were out on the streets organizing, okay, for months. The first call I got from city council was from the speaker. By the time I talked to the speaker, they'd already taken the proposals we had. We had a 50-page platform we put out, and all condensed to one poster of 9 points. They'd already taken those points and turned it into legislation. People are listening. Like, change is coming. It hasn't come fast enough. It's cost us way too much. We've lost way too much, right? But it's finally coming, and we finally got people at the table who are not conflicted, and finally want to see that change happen. But it's not gonna happen unless, as drivers, we lead that fight and we stay out there. So we can't give in to hopelessness, we can't give in to cynicism. We gotta keep organizing, and that's the only way we're gonna see a better day. Yes.
I don't know if the commissioner wanted to give a final word, but
Well, I first want to again thank you for hosting, because I think the work that we're doing translates into many industries, and it is an extremely, I think, as you can tell, complex industry. And what we do today also marks, I think, as Bhairavi pointed out, a lot of change that's coming, because there's one package of bills that did the cap and authorized the income, but there's a second package of bills coming that talks about health care. It talks about capping lease payments, and looking at what the city can do with medallion debt. There is a legal impediment that the council's been wrangling with, which there's a law that the city cannot give money to someone who is an indigent. And so though there's a will to help out with medallion debt by raising capital, there's this legal impediment. So I think that that's something that the council, with the 3 bills that are on the table now that talk about medallion debt, is the council's way of saying we're willing to work to see if there's a way that we can get around it and bring some relief. But the acknowledgement of the need to relief is out there and strong with the city administration and with the city council.
thank you so much. We invite all of you to stay and continue this conversation, and thank you so much for being here tonight.
Thank you.
Thank you.